Good evening and welcome to tonight's event, Euro-Identity, Webs of Language and Self. This is a reading and conversation with the Basque writer Bernardo Atxaga and Mexican-American writer Ilan Stavans. My name is Vivian Schmidt, and I am Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration at Boston University and Director of the Center for International Relations. Tonight's event is the sixth in a series of conversations with European artists and writers that's being organized by the Institute for Human Sciences at Boston University in collaboration with the Center for International Relations, the literary journal Agni, the American Literary Translators Association, and Zephyr Press. Previous speakers in the series include German author Bernhard Schlink, the filmmaker Agnes Varda, German-Turkish poet Zafer Senocak, Romanian poet Liliana Ursu, Hungarian author Attila Bartis, and East German author Clemens Meyer. On Monday, September 21st, so remember you have to come back early next year, next semester. On Monday, September 21st, we will host the British poet Simon Armitage. That's the easiest name to pronounce, mind you. Our Eurospective series is funded by the European Commission delegation in Washington, D.C. We're grateful to the Commission for their support of this initiative. I would also like to thank our partners, Agni editors Sven Burkertz and Bill Pierce, Dr. Chandler Rosenberger of our Department of International Relations, and the Institute for Human Sciences manager Elizabeth Amrian, who makes this all possible every time we have one of these events. I would also like to take a few moments, but very, very brief moments, to introduce our speakers. Basque's strongest literary voice, Bernardo Atxaga, was awarded the 2008 Mondello Prize, whose previous winners included Joseph Brodsky, Doris Lessing, Gunter Grass, Octavio Paz, and Jose Saramago. Atxaga's novels, stories, and poems have been translated into more than 70 languages. His latest novel, The Accordionist's Son, has just been published in the USA by Grey Wolf Press, and it's outside for sale, in fact. Mexican-American intellectual, essayist, and cultural commentator Ilan Stavans is the author of the best-selling The Hispanic Condition, 1995, and Unborrowed Words, a memoir of language, 2001. He has been called the czar of Latino culture in the United States. This is from the New York Times. I like this. And he has been also called Latin America's liveliest and boldest critic and most innovative cultural enthusiast. This is the Washington Post. Stavans is the Louis Sebring Professor of Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College. Our moderator this evening is Mark Feeney, Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic of the Boston Globe. Tonight's event coincides with the release of a new issue of Agni. So before I turn the floor over to Mark, let me introduce to you Agni editor Sven Burkertz, who's going to say a couple words.
Good evening. There's going to be absolutely no intellectual content in what I'm saying. I'm going to just announce that Agni is delighted to be in close collusion with the Institute and to use this event and to piggyback with it to also commemorate, celebrate the just out publication of our new issue. It's our tradition to host a kind of a gathering or a party or a reading around the publication of each issue, and tonight is no exception. So after this event and after the milling around here, we invite all of you, if you are so moved, to come over to our offices, which are in the basement of 236 Bay State Road. There are sheets showing you how to get there. It's about a 4-minute walk. There will be really good tapas and lots of wine. And when you see me get up and leave a little before this event ends, it's because I'm going to pick up the tapas. It's not anything to do with the content of the program. So I'm happy to welcome you all, and I hope you can come over. Thank you.
Hello, as Vivian said, I'm Mark Feeney of the Boston Globe, the still existing Boston Globe. though that may be subject to change. Our program today, or this evening rather, will begin with an essay by Bernardo, but it'll be read by Margaret Colbert of Colby College. Then Ilan will do a reading, and then I will pose some questions to each of them, and the two of them together. And while I'm doing that, if there are any of you out there who yourselves have questions, as I hope there are, if you could just go to either of the two microphones that you'll see flanking you, and I will just start calling on you. Be aware that this is being recorded, so that when you do ask your question, please ask it into the microphone. And by doing that, not only will we have a pleasant and stimulating evening, but future listeners and viewers for eons will have the same pleasure and stimulation. So to begin, I turn the microphone over to Margaret. Or Bernard, I'm not sure which. How we'll do this? Both.
Hello, thank you very much to be here. And thank you very much to Maria Colbert for reading my paper. I think that after so many years living in the Basque country and writing in Basque language with a lot of, problems and so on, I know something about the relationship between culture and politics and so on. But I think that I wrote almost 8 pages, and Maria Colbert, who is a friend of mine, but he is also a specialist on Basque literature and Basque subjects, films, so on. I think it's better for everybody that to listen your reading. Thank you very much.
Situating the Basque Country. One only needs to look at any map of the world from the Middle Ages to understand the importance places such as Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Jerusalem acquired on it. These biblical locations were situated at the center of the world, occupying large areas. Other cities and regions on the planet, on the other hand, were either omitted or took up far less space on the map. This was the case, for example, with the 9th century world map, which features in the Commentary on the Apocalypse by Beatus of Liébana, in which both Egypt and the country of the Jews are represented as being larger than Asia. However, we would be mistaken if we thought that those maps were not of any use and that their representations of the world were erroneous or even ridiculous. That is not the case. In fact, it is thanks to maps such as that of Beatus of Liébana that we are able to measure the value that was assigned in the past to each place, the esteem in which they were held, and even to what extent Christianity reflected the majority viewpoint in the Middle Ages. This information is as fundamental as any scientific knowledge, as it helps us to understand a great many events of that age. Nowadays, there are no world maps that reflect so clearly this measurement of value, but if there were, I'm convinced that some cities and nations, such as New York or the United States, would stretch over enormous areas, far greater than the ones they occupy on the physical maps in use. Latvia, for instance, would be smaller than it really is. What I want to say is that as far as value is concerned, George Bernard Shaw's observation about elephants and fleas does not hold true. He said that elephants were usually smaller in drawings than in reality, and the opposite was true with regard to fleas. No, when assigning value, the great becomes greater, and the insignificant becomes yet more insignificant. And what of the Basque Country, Euskal Herria? How and where would it appear on the map? If we pay heed to a song that was often sung in our streets, "It's so small it's not on the map," then the answer is nowhere. Is that a reasonable point of view? Well, to a certain extent it is. The song would be right on the mark if it were referring to the past, that is, to the times before the 19th century. Until that era, Euskal Herria had no place on the maps of the world simply because it lacked value. Put another way, until the 19th century, the Basque Country lacked ammunition in the symbolic struggle. the struggle for recognition of its cultural difference, to have an image, to have an existence. And, for example, its language, the Basque language, Euskara, was invisible for everyone that surrounded it, and even for many of its natives. In the 18th century, specifically in 1792, the famous politician and intellectual Nicolas de Condorcet presented a report on public education and teaching to the French National Assembly. In it, he recommends the way in which French children and youths should study, and not once does he mention the Basque language, despite this being the only language the majority of the French Basque could speak. Condorcet, a progressive man, wanted schooling for everyone, claiming that education should be universal. But, of course, in the program, he could not include anything which lacked value or which was invisible. He could not include the language, the culture, and the way of life of the inhabitants of small provinces in the Pyrenees. 40 years later, at the dawn of the 19th century, that same invisibility was still evident. Let's look at the works of some writers from the 18th or 19th century. For example, Théophile Gautier traveled from Paris to Madrid, passing through the Basque Country. Later on, in a book entitled Voyage en Espagne, he recounted this journey in detail. However, not once does he mention a single word about the Basque language. Despite passing through villages in which Euskara was the only language spoken, Gautier remained blissfully unaware of the existence of any language other than Spanish or French. On the other hand, Mérimée, a writer from almost the same period as Gautier, did notice the existence of the language. Not only that, in his most well-known work, the novela Carmen, he made two of his main characters Basque. In the novella, the gypsy Carmen is Basque, or at least she says she is, and so is the bandit, whose name, be prepared for surprise, those of you who have not read the book, was José Lizárraga Bengoa. But then came Bizet with his opera Carmen. And thanks to that version, the characters from the original piece were converted into symbols of the southern Spanish heritage. There it is. Before the 19th century, the Basque Country was very weak in the symbolic struggle and lacked visibility, as are all things that are not valued by the representatives of the dominant culture. In this period of history, Euskal Herria had no place in the world, and its language, as Lichtenberg would say, was something similar to a coin that was not legal currency. You could use it at home or perhaps even in church, but not for the school nor the court, nor even, generally speaking, in public life. Put another way, the language was condemned to disappear, along with all its accompanying cultural characteristics. Some years ago, I visited the cemetery of Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. I found many Basque names, but the Basque language only appeared on the headstone of a family that had emigrated during the Spanish Civil War. I understood then what a Latin American friend had written to me once. The Basques who went to America in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries forgot their origins overnight, and they integrated with the Uruguayan, Argentinian, or Venezuelan societies as if dissolving in water. The immigrants did not value their language or their culture, and once across the ocean, they abandoned them like an old suitcase. Exactly the same thing would have happened in the Basque Country itself, that is, to an even greater extent than it did actually happen, if in our neighboring European countries, in Germany to be exact, the political and cultural movement known as Romanticism had not arisen. With Romanticism, the Basque Country, Euskal Herria, would achieve a place on the world map. It would gain value. It would win a symbolic battle. Quote, "We must not underestimate the worth of those languages which have no literature," wrote Wilhelm the Elder of the Humboldt brothers. "We can learn much from them. The languages which appear to be small and crude provide important raw material for refined and complex cultures." Humboldt was not only a man of words. Like his brother Alexander, geographer and explorer, his behavior reflected the same curiosity, the same breadth of vision. A breadth of vision which enabled him to see that which was small and that which apparently was of no value. Wilhelm Humboldt traveled from one country to another, and as Johann Herder, one of the inspirers of the Romantic movement, had done before him, got to know different societies, cultures, and languages in Europe and other continents. Quote, "What makes the European civilization so brilliant and advanced? asked Johann Herder in his report on the origin of languages. Above all, it is the abundance of peoples and ideals, its warm climate, and its relationship with other peoples. The first part of this statement should be underlined. European civilization is great due to the abundance of peoples and ideals. This was a new point of view, far from that shared by Nicolas de Condorcet. To assess the worth of nations or peoples, the Romantics focused above all on the language of those places. The language is the indicator of human life, and the spirit of the different peoples and races, that peculiar spirit known as Volkgeist, is evident in the syntax and in the phonetic characteristics of those languages. Thus, the syntax of the German language makes it especially appropriate for metaphysics. The quality of French, on the other hand, is clarity, and so it is with all languages. There is no language without a quality. Each and every language has its own, even those that, as Humboldt said, appear small and crude. Although some of the ideas of the Romantics came from previous centuries, their way of understanding the world was new, and the people who inhabited the invisible nations and cultures, those undervalued and with little symbolic capital, quickly learned to grasp this vision of the world. Even 100 years after Humboldt's death in 1931, Ingracio de Aranzadi, the Basque politician, published his book, The Basque Nation, writing in the prologue that, quote, "The Basque civilization in prehistoric times must have been admirable, given the magnificent verb structure of our language." The final part of this statement should be underlined, the magnificent verb structure of our language. Therein lies the value, the element that can bring prestige and recognition to cultures like the Basque. Similarly, at the beginning of the 20th century, the linguist Justo Mokoroa dedicated these words to the Basque language in the book Genius and Language. Quote, "For us, it is the vehicle and instrument of a lofty civilization, the summit of genuine values, a sign of ennoblement." Isaiah Berlin expressed in a way that is difficult to match that Germany felt itself to be in a corner of Europe, as if it had failed to achieve greatness. No golden age, no geniuses like Shakespeare or Cervantes, without artists the likes of Italians Leonardo, Michelangelo, and many others. And its sense of inferiority grew next to the grand France of the 17th and 18th centuries, where, among other hundreds of intellectuals and artists, were giants such as Rousseau, Diderot, d'Alembert, Voltaire, and Napoleon. Quote, "This feeling of lagging behind," wrote Berlin, "of being the brunt of ridicule of the French, with their overwhelming sense of national and cultural superiority, gave rise to a sense of collective humiliation, which then turned into indignation and hostility. This mood reached a feverish height during the national resistance against Napoleon, reacting, to put it in the words of the poet Schiller, like a bending branch, and turning into a model for many societies which, irritated by the visible inferiority of their condition, react by harking back to glories and triumphs, real or imaginary from the past, or to enviable attributes of their own national or cultural character. As those of you who are familiar with a little of our history will know, educated Basques embraced this model. They were prepared to occupy this space. They had all that was necessary to do so. On the one hand, the singularity of Euskara coincided completely with this new sensitivity. On the other, they were filled with the humiliation of belonging to a country and to a culture which was valued lightly, and precisely because of this, apologists and intellectuals such as Garibay, Larramendi, and others proclaimed, reacting like bending branches, the antiquity of the Basque language, of Euskara. Euskara was, quote, "the first language of Spain and perhaps of the whole world." They wished to respond to those who had described it as a language that was coarse and vulgar. A digression about language. As perhaps many of you know, most of the languages spoken today in Europe come from ancient Indo-European. However, this is not the case with Euskara, which has survived that language, and also those which were later dominant, Celtic and Latin, maintaining characteristics which distance it from the language family tree, with parents unknown. As may be expected, this rarity attracted the attention of great linguists, from the aforementioned Humboldt to Vincent to Schuckardt, and inspired numerous legends regarding its origins. Was Euskara the language spoken by the inhabitants of the lost Atlantis, as purported by Donnelly? Were the coincidences with Caucasian or Berber languages significant? Sooner or later, all of us Basque writers came to write about its rarity. Some in order to extol its virtues. Others, this is my case, to describe it. To describe it and to give an insight into Basque literature, as I did in the prologue poem I included in the English language edition of my book, Obabakoak. Bernardo will read this poem.
A break for Maria. We speak a strange language. Its verbs, the structure of its relative clauses, the words it uses to designate ancient things, rivers, plants, birds, have no sisters anywhere on earth. A house is eche, a bee erle, death eriot. The sun of the long winters we call euski or eki. The sun of the sweet rainy springs is also, as you suspect, called euski or eki. It's a strange language, but not so strange. Born, they say, in the megalithic age, it survived this stubborn language, but by withdrawing, by hiding away like a hedgehog in a place which, thanks to the traces it left behind there, the world named the Basque Country or Euskal Herria, yet its isolation could never have been absolute. Cat is katu, pipe is pipa, logic is logica. Rather, as the prince of detectives would have said, the hedgehog, my dear Watson, crept out of its hiding place to visit, above all, Rome and all its progeny. The language of a tiny nation so small you cannot even find it on the map. It never strolled in the gardens of the court or past the marble statues of government buildings. In 4 centuries, it produced only 100 books, the first in 1545, the most important in 1643, the Calvinist New Testament in 1571, the complete Catholic Bible around 1860. Its sleep was long, its bibliography brief, but in the 20th century, the hedgehog awoke.
Linguists had prophesied that the language would disappear towards the middle of the 20th century, but the gloomy predictions have not been fulfilled. Nowadays, the proportion of Basques who use their language daily is greater than 25% of the population, some 700,000 people, and one has the impression that in fewer than 50 years, the majority of society will be bilingual. This is the case at least in the Spanish part of the Basque Country, in Euskadi and in Navarra, where the citizens have autonomous governments and where now Euskara has the status of an official language. Not so in the 3 small Basque provinces in France, where the language has hardly any official support. Let's now continue with the subject of value, of the struggle for recognition. Isaiah Berlin stated that the countries which felt inferior harked back to glories and triumphs, real or imaginary, from the past, or to enviable attributes of their culture. In the 19th century, once again faithfully following the template, novelists such as Navarro Villoslada or poets like Agustín Chao took the first route and created the literary legends of Amaya and Aitor, which were to have so much influence. Nowadays, a fair number of Basques bear the name Amaya or Aitor. Others, particularly the linguists and the anthropologists, opted for the other route, that of identifying the attractive characteristics of their own culture. To sum up, the Romantic movement gave a space to those that had none in the past. They gave value and symbolic capital where previously none had existed. This had happened in Germany itself. It happened here in the United States at the time when the West was won, when the great landscapes of the Grand Canyon or Yosemite were discovered and immediately became cathedrals, divine works of art, no less impressive than the European works of art such as Notre Dame in Paris or St. Peter's in Rome. But in the case of the Basque Country and other places, which in contrast to Germany or the United States lacked political power and were what we now call stateless nations, the consequences were different. As is well known, the political theory which has had most influence throughout history is that which centers political legitimacy on cultural fact, that which states that, quote, a nation, a collective with its own culture, has the right to form a separate political unit. This is the theory of the nation-state, championed by all those societies which, following the Romantic movement, believed themselves to be in possession of a different culture or identity, and began to claim their right to form their own political unit, an independent state. Put another way, all those who had managed to find themselves a place on the map of world value began to fight for a place on the other world map, the political one. That is what happened in an area of the Pyrenees between Spain and France. That is what happened in the Basque Country. At the end of the 19th century, the first nationalist party was formed, the work of the politician Sabino Arana. He called his utopia Euskadi, claiming that Euskadi was the homeland of the Basques. And in the first third of the 20th century, his claim met with a great popular echo. The perception that the Basque culture was different from that of Spain and France was quite widespread, as was the idea that the so-called fueros, the special judicial statute that the Basque provinces had had since the 15th century, supported this difference and the desire to form an independent political unit, a sovereign Euskadi. In the beginning, there were many positive aspects, as value was attributed and the Basques became visible, but there were also perils. The same perils which materialized in Germany from 1930 and then later on in the Balkans. It is well known that the ideas of a romantic origin tend to exacerbate difference, to enlarge the differential factor, and that they have a peculiar contradiction. Their hypersensitivity when it comes to detecting differences with their neighbors, with the Spanish or the French, for example, disappears completely when it comes to judging their own country. To explain with an example, some people who currently defend the Basque language, Euskara, are unwilling to accept the fact that in the Basque Country, Spanish and French are 2 centuries-old languages which have been used by the Basque people since the Middle Ages. Those that form part of this social sector think, of course, in terms of the essential, and are of the opinion that the Basque Country, Euskal Herria, was established and completed forevermore way back in the Neolithic times, a Neolithic age in which Basque was spoken, and that everything which came later, for example, the languages of Latin origin, were merely accidents, circumstantial realities. In those places which are looking for a space on the map, cultural and political movements go hand in hand and rotate on a double axis. The positive axis, which claims the value that it deserves, which looks for equality, and the negative axis, which, as I have said, only sees differences and leans towards essentialism. In the Basque Country, politics and culture quickly began turning on the positive axis. There was a crucial moment when the essentialist ideas might have triumphed. Certainly, racism was by no means absent from the demands of Sabino Arana, by then named founder of the first Basque Nationalist Party. But the fact is, this triumph did not come about. On the contrary, the struggle for a place on the map of the world, on the map representing value, as well as the political map, followed democratic roots in our country. Proof of this is, on the one hand, the position of Basque nationalism during the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, 30 years after the death of Sabino Arana, it supported the Republic and fought defiantly against fascism. See George Steer's book. On the other hand, proof of the radical democratic spirit of the Basque nationalism is the life and work of the Lehendakari, the head of state, of the first Basque government, José Antonio Aguirre. See his autobiography, also published in the United States, and with certain success, called Freedom Was Flesh and Blood. The democratic and anti-fascist attitude of Basque nationalism does have a symbol which occupies a space on the world map, and which is, even today, a universal one, Guernica. As you know, it is the name of a small Basque town which was bombed by the German Nazi Air Force at the behest of the Spanish fascists. The previously mentioned British journalist, George Steer, was the first to tell the world about, quote, the first bombing in the history of a civil population. The artist Pablo Picasso immortalized the event in which it is perhaps the most famous, in what is perhaps the most famous painting of all time, and which bears the name of the town as its title, Guernica. I will finish with two poems. The first is a sonnet by William Wordsworth, written in 1810 and entitled The Oak of Guernica. I recite it to show that Guernica was already a symbol of liberty long before the bombardment, due to the obligation of all Spanish monarchs to swear there, next to this oak, the promise to respect the fueros, the Basque laws. The poem describes it like this. Oak of Guernica. Oak of Guernica, tree of holier power than that which in Dodona did enshrine, so faith too fondly deemed, a voice divine heard from the depths of its aerial bower. How canst thou flourish at this blighting hour? What hope, what joy can sunshine bring to thee, or the soft breezes from the Atlantic Sea, the dews of morn or April's tender shower? Stroke merciful and welcome would that be which would extend thy branches on the ground, if nevermore within their shady round those lofty-minded lawgivers shall meet, peasant and lord in their appointed seat, guardians of Biscay's ancient liberty. And Biscay is the word used to mean the Basque country. When we speak about the relationship between culture and politics, about societies which live in conflict due to this question, we tend to speak in general terms, but facts are unique and occur in one way or another for distinct reasons. That the struggle of the Basques to have a place in the world has turned, in general, on a positive axis has probably to do with the democratic tradition captured by William Wordsworth in his poem, and with the personality of the nationalist leaders during the Spanish Civil War, with a special mention for the first Nendakari, or head of the Basque government, the aforementioned José Antonio Aguirre. I would like now to recite a second poem. It was written at the end of the 1960s by Gabriel Aresti, and is perhaps one of the most famous poems in the Basque language. As I see it, it reflects perfectly the attitude of a large section of Basque society during the military dictatorship which followed the Spanish Civil War, a dictatorship which prohibited the use of the Basque language in public, as well as any other form of cultural expression, in an attempt to erase the Basques from the map of political value, from the map of value, the political map from all maps. The poem by Gabriel Aresti is titled in Basque, Nire Aitairenetxea, which in English is The House of My Father. It goes like this.
I shall defend the house of my father against wolves, against droughts, against usury, against justice. I shall defend the house of my father. I shall lose cattle, orchards, pine woods. I shall lose interest, incomes, dividends, but I shall defend the house of my father. They will take away my weapons, and with my hands I shall defend the house of my father. They will cut off my hands, and with my arms I shall defend the house of my father. They will leave me without arms, without shoulders, without chest, and with my hands I shall defend the house of my father. I shall die, my soul will be lost, my progeny will be lost, but the house of my father will still stand upright.
Democracy came to Spain at the end of the 1970s, and autonomous politics were set up again. A new Basque government was formed. The situation changed, although the struggle for value, the symbolic value which, as was beginning to be seen in this era, involved the attainment of other values, especially economic value, continued. The change from one era to another was not as clear as from black to white, and, to quote the most renowned case, the violence of ETA did not end. In fact, it increased and they became a terrorist group. But I have spoken about this part of our reality in my novels and in texts, which, in an autobiographical style, I published in some European newspapers. And those of you who are interested in the subject can follow the trail of my thoughts in them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Maria Kolberg for his work.
I love the image of that was invoked of George Bernard Shaw, of the elephant and the flea, and the different sizes that they have when one draws them in a piece of paper. I don't know exactly how small or how big would the geography of the Hebrew language be. Probably would spill out of that page, or probably would be tiny, almost insignificant, depending on when we would be doing that drawing. For the Hebrew language was frozen, not dead, but frozen for over 2,000 years. And suddenly, as a result of the same type of nationalism that Bernardo was speaking about, came back to acquire a pretty prominent place on the world map. I had been hoping to write a book, not about the Hebrew language, but about the Hebrew alphabet for quite some time. I grew up in a multilingual environment in Mexico, where the first two languages were Yiddish and Spanish. I hesitate to describe them as mother tongues because one has only one mother. But if one could describe oneself as having two, then both of them would have an equal status. There were other languages that also played a role in my upbringing, and mine in many ways was no way unique. That of other Mexican Jews included English and French, if those Jews were from the former Ottoman Empire, and Hebrew. Hebrew had been the language of the synagogue and of Talmudic discussion, a language isolated from daily life, not a domestic language, but a language of the intellect. I like to see Hebrew not only today as a horizontal language, that is a language that we speak among ourselves, but also a vertical one in that it is the language of God, according to the Bible. God is supposed to have written the world before the world was created through letters, and only after those letters arranged themselves to configure what is the Bible today, did the world begin to exist as we know it. And so I thought that because the letters precede the world, it would be lovely to devote a meditation to them, and not only because they precede them, but because also they have accompanied the journey of those, the Jews that have used it throughout the centuries. The Hebrew letters and not the Hebrew language, because there have been a number of different Jewish languages that have used those letters, Yiddish and Ladino and Judo-Italian and Judo-Arabic, and they can or not be close to Hebrew in its semantic, it's a morphological structure. More often than not, actually, they are far, far away, being closer to German or to Spanish in the case of Yiddish and Ladino. But I didn't know how to write this book, and I struggled for quite some time, often in my case waiting for that first sentence to show up, and the moment it does, thinking, hoping that like a faucet that opens up, the rest would simply take shape. Struggling and anxious as I was, I had made a commitment with a publisher. I was at a point of literally giving up the idea when this happened. Some years ago, I had the first of two dreams that pushed me to an unexpected search, the way dreams are often or sometimes able to do. In that dream, I was at a dinner party in an elegant apartment. I had never been there before. One of the hosts had invited me, but when she opened the door and greeted me, I realized she had forgotten my name. She stuttered while trying to recall it, but to no avail. She then apologized, and I told her not to worry. I, too, have trouble remembering names. Thankfully, I never forget my own, at least not yet, I said, as I told this to her. The host smiled and walked me into the living room. There were about a dozen people in the apartment, none of whom I knew. As I often do at parties, I got a glass of wine, found a comfortable chair, and sat down to observe. A voluptuous young woman with curly hair, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres, walked toward me. She took a seat by my side and began an enthralling tale about an ugly, menacing beast she had seen at the zoo. The name of the beast sounded like the leverant, something like that. She repeated the word several times as if I knew what that word meant. She said it was a fanciful, long-necked bird with a multicolored tail that fans out like a rainbow. The beast resembled a tall turkey with a head so small it could pass for a tennis ball and a double chin that dangled bizarrely under the long beak. Those who crossed its path swore that its penetrating eyes could frighten even a cobra. Its legs, ending in 3 claws, looked like pencils. And although it couldn't fly because of its meager wings, the wind could lift the beast so that it hovered overhead as if suspended by invisible strings. Strange, I said. It sings some perplexing tunes, the woman whispered, and it feeds on yermelakis. I asked her what a yermelaki was, but she ignored my question. I suddenly realized that yermelaki wasn't the only word I hadn't understood. As she spun her yarn, it became increasingly difficult to follow her sentences. She seemed to be speaking in a foreign language. I was completely at a loss. Was she still talking about the leverant? I felt uncomfortable and looked around. I saw a cadre of rabbis. One of them resembled a great-grandfather of mine, Kalman Eisenberg, whose sepia photograph given to me by my mother hangs in the ground floor hallway of my house. The other rabbis looked like what Kalman Eisenberg's friends probably looked like. I told the woman I needed fresh air and headed in the direction of the rabbis, who I believed were conferring about a Talmudic passage, something about an apple falling from a tree into the yard on a neighbor's side of the fence. Does the apple belong to the owner of the tree, or is it now the neighbor's property, asked one of the rabbis. Since dreams allow for dead people to come visit, I asked great-grandfather Kalman if he knew what language the attractive woman spoke. He looked at me in disbelief. But of course, he replied, it's Hebrew. She's my niece. I can't believe it, I replied. I know Hebrew. You do? He questioned. Then you must be aware that God doesn't act alone. He is perpetually in need of help. I looked toward the chair where the beautiful woman had been sitting. To my surprise, she had taken off her clothes. She must have been in her early 30s, but her short, curly black hair made her look even younger. Her beauty was simply stunning. The woman was sitting next to a rabbi. In the dream, yes, it crossed my mind that such a scene was utterly impossible. Rabbis aren't supposed to be with women who aren't their spouses, let alone naked ones. At this point, I woke up in a cold sweat. My teeth were chattering. Dreams can refer to unfinished business we might have, people we're in debt to, journeys we're ready to embark on. They have something to say to us, something that reason alone cannot explain. The Talmud says that an uninterpreted dream is like an unread letter. I spent weeks trying to sort out my dream. The face of the woman wasn't recognizable to me. I couldn't remember having thought about Kalman Eisenberg in the preceding weeks. Maybe the act of simply walking back and forth through the ground floor hallway of my house in Amherst had brought the image into my unconscious. I still didn't know what a yermelaki was. Could it be an echo of the Yiddish word for head covering? And the presence of the liverant, yet, was easier for me to explain. Not that I had ever seen such an anomalous creature, but recently I had become interested in imaginary animals, and as a result had acquired an old copy of The First Voyage Round the World by Magellan, an 1874 edition translated by Lord Stanley de Adderley about imaginary kingdoms. It contained references to a couple of beautiful dead birds from, quote, the terrestrial paradise, end of quote, called Bolom Niwatha. The birds were said to be, quote, large as thrushes with small heads, long beaks, legs slender like a writing pen, and a span in length, end of quote. Instead of wings, they have, quote, long feathers of different colors like plumes, and they never fly except when the wind blows, end of quote. I had been intrigued by those curious animals, but it wasn't the liverant what most attracted me. The part of the dream that kept coming back to my mind involved the unintelligible woman. Was it really Hebrew she was speaking? How come I couldn't understand her? Why did she undress in my dream? And how to explain the reference to God needing help? Several months later, I told a friend of mine who has known me for decades about the dream. I described to him the whole thing in detail, and his response was unexpected. Have you forgotten your Hebrew, Ilan? He asked. Why? I really didn't have much to say. Well, maybe I have. There was a time when I could speak it fluently, but I haven't used it in years. I paused. Yes, maybe I have abandoned it. Then he said that I was going through a period of language withdrawal. I had never heard the expression before, language withdrawal, yet I immediately felt guilty. My friend said, losing one's Hebrew might be synonymous of losing one's soul. Shortly after this scene took place, my friend sent me a package in the mail, and when I opened it, it was an old edition of a book called A Dream Come True. It was written in the early 20th century by Eliezer Ben Yehuda, the so-called architect of the resurrection of the Hebrew language. The word resurrection might not sound too Jewish, but after all, this is what he is supposed to have said, to have brought back this language that had disappeared or had been frozen into a language that had now a country and a place and a mythology and a paraphernalia. Let me just wrap up things by telling you that Eliezer Ben Yehuda, whose anniversary, 150 years birthday, was celebrated last year, spent his entire life moving from Lithuania, where he was born, to France, and eventually through Turkey to what was then, at the end of the 19th century, Ottoman Jerusalem. He married in the way and had a child. And when he arrived to Jerusalem, he forced his wife and his little one never to speak any language other than Hebrew, a language that was not spoken by anybody except these three. His favorite book, not surprisingly, was Robinson Crusoe. His second quest, not only isolating his family, but his second quest was to begin a publication in a language, again, that was not spoken by anybody, and to turn it into a newspaper. And third, he wanted to create an army of teachers that eventually would make this language become the centerpiece of the new nationalist movement of the Jewish people, Zionism. His real passion was lexicography, and that's where I found him to be so empathetic to my own vision. I have devoted myself to the study of Spanglish and to its codes and strategies. He started putting together a dictionary. He was no Dr. Johnson. The definitions are rather flat. And unlike Johnson too, he died too soon, 1922, when he was writing the definition for the word nefesh, soul, in Hebrew, and thus he didn't reach the end. When he died, he had many friends and supporters, but he had one group that was adamantly opposed to him. They were not the Arabs. The Arabs actually were quite sympathetic. They were the Orthodox Jews. Since then, till today, they have tried to erase the memory of Ben Yehuda. For if Hebrew is supposed to come back from the refrigerator, it will be by the Mashiach, the Messiah, and not an apostate, a pseudo-Messiah, a political figure like Ben Yehuda. What I found most intriguing of his quest, though, was the fact that literally 150 years after his death, Hebrew is alive and well in a very controversial language, a language that to many of us today, in many of us today, can generate the same discomfort that in the 50s and 60s German could have generated. A language that is very much at the center of the geopolitical view, and yet a language that is incredibly alive, incredibly messy. A trip to Israel will show you that there are all sorts of Hebrews spoken today. The Hebrew of the Orthodox who dislike Ben Yehuda, the Hebrew of the young who turn it into slang, who destroy it and recreate it. There's the Hebrew and the Arabic that clash and get married together just as like Spanglish does, called Hebrea, a mixture, a code switching that is truly messianic, or at least that brings forth the idea that the two can mix and come together. And there is also the fact that Hebrew is a language today that is spoken by millions of Israelis in the diaspora. Many who have left Israel unhappy with the concept of nationalism and have turned the language, Ben Yehuda would have been appalled by it, into a language of those that don't have a state or that long for a state, like Yiddish and like Ladino, another Jewish language. The Bible has a total of roughly a little more than 8,000 different words. I'm not saying that the Bible has a total of 8,000 different words, but a total of 8,000 different words. The vocabulary of the authors of the Bible was no larger than barely a little more than 8,000 words. Shakespeare, many centuries later, had at his disposal 16,000 words. Today, the English language has more than 900,000, almost a million. Hebrew today is a language that is coming close to having, according to the latest lexicographers, close to 100,000 words. Now that is revival. What we do with the words is another story. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. This is on. Just a reminder, if you have a question, just step up to the microphone and you'll be called on. But in the meantime, I'll ask a few questions of both of our guests and we shall see what they have to say. I found one of the more striking things in Bernardo's essay was his passing comment about the quality of individual languages. French lending itself to clarity, German to metaphysics. So I would like to ask a question of both Bernardo and Ilan, and that is, it's a very unfair question, but those are often the most interesting kind, and that is if they would each characterize the quality of the languages they speak. In Bernardo's case, Euskara and Spanish, and in Ilan's case, Spanish, English, Hebrew, and Yiddish. I didn't say it was fair.
First of all, for me, as a romantic young, my language was a kind of distinction, because our language was so different, was so ancient language according to the Romantic theories. And I think that for me at this time, as a young people, for me the most important thing was the distinction, the difference. But 30 years later, my language is, first of all, the language of my notebooks, the language of my books, but at the same time is one of my two languages. So at this moment when I watch, to me, I see myself as a bilingual people. Spanish and Basque, for me, are two close languages. Is the only, maybe, the characteristic I see. When, excuse me, my English, childish exposition. When I was young, for me, it was very important to explain to people that, for instance, in the case of in Basque language, masculine and feminine don't exist except in the verb. No, because in Basque, maybe the most important difference with the other languages is that in our verb, if we say ik doe, is you have masculine, but if we say ik doen with n, is feminine, and maybe, I don't know why, but it's a difference with the other languages. But now, for me, this kind of characteristics are no importance. For me, it's important my work, my notebooks, my books, my relatives, my friends, and I think language is a very, in the second or third step. Yes. Line. Well, bueno, diría más cosas, pero no puedo. I cannot. En español sería, yo diría en español, que cuando uno es romántico está hipnotizado con la lengua, con la diferencia. Esa es la única luz que ve, es como una hipnosis, pero que afortunadamente a medida que pasa el tiempo y el mundo se amplía y las cuestiones de la vida cobran otra importancia. La lengua sigue siendo importante en la vida íntima de una persona, en la mía, pero no está para nada en esa primera línea, ni en la segunda, quizá ni en la tercera, ¿no? Es decir, hay cosas más importantes. Ese ha sido el mayor cambio en mi vida. Excuse me.
I would like to answer by not answering directly the question because I don't know exactly how to answer it. And
have you considered a future in politics?
I discovered recently that from the exact same environment, almost at the same time, a year younger than Eliezer Ben Yehuda, was another man, also a Lithuanian, called Eliezer Zamenhof, who actually celebrates his 150th birthday this year, and he was the creator of Esperanto. Esperanto seems to me the reverse of the story of Hebrew. Zamenhof wanted Esperanto to be the universal language, a kind of reversal of the Tower of Babel. We would all speak one language in order to be able to understand each other, and thus peace would come to mankind or to humankind. Hebrew instead wanted to make Jews different, wanted to make Jews unique, but it was also in Ben Yehuda's vision a language that would erase all other diaspora languages, all other Jewish language for good. For Zionism meant the end of history as Jews knew it. It would conclude the diaspora life in the United States or in Mexico or in Poland or anywhere else. This to say, Mark, that languages for me are like masks that one puts on. And it's not that one is better than the other, it's just that one is convenient at a particular time than the other. But by putting on a mask, you really put on an entire personality, a different way of moving your hands, and you're making facial gestures and becoming a different person. I find immigrants to be the real carriers of a language across borders and across time. And we often in this country hear that it's the immigrants who are destroying the English language, who are not embracing it as the natives do. But I believe that it's immigrants who really dream of inhabiting a language in the full sense of the term, because they know what it means to have been outside a language. And just like a convert in religion, they learn to love it in a way that often we natives might not.
Well, you mentioned immigrants, and that reminds me of one of my favorite literary quotes from an immigrant to this country. He was forced to be an immigrant, and that was Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, who once said that he had, in his opinion, the best of all linguistic worlds. He wrote poetry in Russian, he wrote prose in English, and he wrote letters in French. Both of you are situated in several languages. I wonder if you might want to talk about how you see your own personal relationship to the various languages you live your life in.
Well, very shortly, I wrote an article which published by a Californian Threepenny Review is the name of the review, speaking about my relationship with different languages. But yes, I know Brodsky's work, and I have heard a lot of times of Conrad and so on. But I would like to to say very, very, with a strong that is not the usual case. I think that the people with us different, related with different languages, as is strange people in this world. I think that is no. I mean, we are the exception. It's no. I think the wind of the, excuse me to speak with this metaphorical way, but I have no any other way. The wind of the world is in the opposite direction. It's not usual. Brodsky, Conrad, so on. Well, they are very, very, very strange writers. Bilingual people is strange, I think, in this world. And the power is always in the other, pushing in the other direction. This is the reality, the big reality, the heavy reality.
I disagree with Bernardo. I do believe that bilingual writers are a minority, but bilingualism is a facet of life that is spoken by billions of people. And in fact, most people live in countries where there are 2 or 3 or 4 languages, except that we often, in the US, have the impression, and in certain parts of Europe, that the world is monolingual and that bilingualism is curable, and we can overcome it. Talking about Brodsky once told me that he had translated from the Spanish into Russian, Juan Ramón Jiménez. But he spoke not a single word of Spanish, not one. And I asked him the same question I recently asked Richard Wilbur, who translated Borges and Jorge Guillén from Spanish into English without knowing a single word of Spanish. And both responded that you don't need to know the original language in order to write good poetry. You need a conduit. You need someone who will give you the essence of the poem and teach you on the structure, the patterns, in order to make it come alive in the receiving language. Now, to my surprise, and maybe to yours too, the translations of Wilbur from Spanish into English are wonderful. I can't judge the Russian of Brodsky. I believe that the tendency is to live in translation, though. I believe that even when we don't want to see it, translation is what modern life is about, often without an original. The original has been lost. And it is just that we, as in a palimpsest, are speaking of a culture or an essence that has disappeared, but have that tendency that Bernardo was talking about of moving toward monolingualism.
I'm afraid we are exaggerating. Maybe it's true that there are a lot of people in Europe bilingual. Maybe it's true, and I was exaggerating. But I think that your point, I mean, translate Juan Ramón Jiménez from Spanish into Russian without knowing any word, just such poet as Juan Ramón Jiménez. I'm afraid is also una exageración.
Happily, I didn't do it. It was Brodsky who did it.
No, I think the languages are sometimes far. I think. Bueno, there is a translator of García Lorca.
My question goes to Bernardo Atxaga. Will excuse my first words, but hace posa, se zirrara, Bernardo. Hainbeste liburu eskuetatik pasaostean zu hemen ikustea.
Bueno,
what a joy to see the writer of the books of my childhood here in Boston. My question will be fair, a yes or no question. Bernardo envisions a future for the Basque country where instead of a Basque country, country will evolve to a Basque city, a city where all the endless ways of feeling Basque culture, the endless ways of despising Basque culture, or the 1,000 ways of being Basque will live and tolerate each other in a peaceful Basque city. So my yes or no question is, tomorrow a new Basque government will be constituted. I don't know, but Bernardo, are we closer to that peaceful Basque city? Urbilago algagoz, Euskal iritik, bakea urbilago aldago, bai, ala ez. I changed topics a little bit, but eskerrik asko. We use a very long word to say thank you. We say eskerrik asko.
Bueno, in Basque we say ez dut uste. I don't think so. Yes, it's true that I have written about my personal utopia called Euskal Herri Iria. It's a kind of play of words, because Euskal Herria means it's the village, village, the Basque village, and Iria is a Basque city, and there is almost a play of words. But telling briefly, my idea about the Basque city came from the history of Greece, of the ancient Greece. You know the foundation of Athens. Outside Athens, or before Athens, there were a lot of different tribes, I don't know, tribes, and fighting, and the Atenea and so on. There is a history, and people decided to build this Athens for everybody, different, societies, different groups, and living together. It's not an heroic utopia, but just a utopia for a good relationship between people. This is in few words, But I think that in the Basque country, I am a very, very lonely man in my political ideology, because when I say the Basque city, all the people say no more trains, no more planes, no more, they understand city as urbs, and no as polis, I am always speaking about polis. All the people understand urbs, so it's impossible. So I prefer not to have hope.
Hi, good evening. Buenas tardes. I actually want to push you a little bit further into the direction of introducing politics into the question of the production of literature. So that's why I actually would invite Mark also to answer this question, which is, what are, in your opinion, the conditions that transform a book, a literary book, into a classic? And what's basically the role of politics in the process of transforming a book into a classic? And I'm asking you this because, classics belong to canons, and in certain sense, canons are also acts of power. So if we, see this from an empirical viewpoint, in Mexico, for example, Los de Abajo by Mariano Azuela is part of one of the classics in Mexican literature. In the U.S., for example, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is also considered a classic. And in Spain, the writings of Pío Baroja and Unamuno, several of their books are actually considered canonicals, right? So that's why, but then, maybe the books I have mentioned are not actually known in the US or in Mexico or in Spain. So that's why the idea, would be to reflect upon, what is the role of politics, in transforming books into classics. Okay, thank you. If you wanna put it.
Excuse me, can you answer? And I'm going to ask.
If you want to put the question in a simpler way, why are we still reading the Iliad? Don Quixote, Madame Bovary.
Well, I'll take a shot at it, and then Ilan as well, perhaps. I would say specifically with those books, and just in the large, they're not about politics. Literature and art generally is completely about means, and politics is all about ends. And to that extent, politics can be a part of art, but it's such an ultimately trivial part. I think that it's incidental at best. Politics is about the now, and literature is what survives the now.
I would begin by suggesting it's a very large question, very complicated and very inviting, thought-provoking as well. First and foremost, I would say that just as merciless capitalist society is defined by social Darwinism, the shaping of a literary canon is also the result of a Darwinian force that is much larger than the authors, readers, and editors that are behind the manufacturing of it. While there is an attempt to establish rules, there is also accident, playfulness, and the unexpected. There's no classic without a community that needs a classic. A canon is the formation of a collective mythology by a community that wants to define itself in favor or against the books that explain its own origins or its alternatives. And then I would say that a classic is a book that is constantly being read differently by the forthcoming generation, revamped and revised in a way that the author could not have expected. And why one book and not another? It is the question that most editors in New York would like answered right now, and not from me, certainly.
Well, for me, the concept to understand the relationship between, for instance, politics and canon, literary canon, is the box of resonance, you know, the box of resonance, because I mean, in the very simple, I'm going to give you an example. For me, till 70s in Europe, the most strengthful,
Strongest, more
powerful, the more powerful resonant voice was communism. In the publisher houses, writers and newspapers, etc. No? And I remember that, for instance, in Finland, there is a, excuse me, because it's very difficult to me to explain some stupid things, but well, there is a very big and important festival in Finland called Lahti Festival. And when I went to this festival in 90s, communism was thrown away and so on, and all the writers, Russian writers, Polish writers, were anti-communist. They were, excuse me, I am speaking like this, on fashion, you know, very fashion. But the first day of this festival, we watched a film, the first of the first festival of Lahti. It was just 2 years later than Cuba, the Cuban Revolution. And in this film, all the writers speaking about Cuba, about Che Guevara, and all the Latin American and Spanish writers, we should push the revolution, etc., etc. I mean, critics, translators, publishers, writers, were all of them philo-communist, you know. So I mean that in this case, well, with this sample, we can see the importance of being communist, or in 60s or now. It's very, very different for a writer, no? I think. For instance, Neruda, the case of Neruda. Neruda was a Nobel Prize because his resonance box was very, very powerful. I think that a poet, the equivalent poet of Neruda at this time, being communist, etc., is impossible to win the Nobel Prize. Excuse me, I don't know if I express, but en español lo diría mejor.
Hi, I'm taking it back to literature from politics for a second. In literature, we're often sort of forced to read in translation, and we're having, or if we're bold, we're trying to read in the original language. And I think that being both of you as multilingual speakers and writers, you are often, and all of us who sort of try to live in the multicultural world in which we live, are sort of forced to attempt to speak languages that are not our first or second or third language. And I was wondering how you felt about that as as a creative act, as sort of becoming a new, you mentioned earlier that it sort of forces you to take on a new personality that is a different part of yourself. And I was thinking, do you see this speaking in this language that you may not speak very well in, forcing to say things that you wouldn't normally say, do you see that as more a literary act than a social act?
I read not too long ago that English is the third largest language in the world in terms of speakers, but it is by far the most important in terms of business transactions, marketing, advertising, politics, and so on. In the same article, I read that 1 out of every 3 English language speakers is a native speaker. In other words, 2 out of those 3 are non-native English speakers, meaning broken English speakers that live anywhere in the world and that they describe themselves as using the English language. Now, I think the ratio is fascinating insofar as it puts enormous pressure on the natives to keep the language going. And yet it also creates a kind of creative explosiveness because you can literally do anything in the English language in China among people that can speak English by knowing 250 words alone. And we have all seen in the internet the English translations that the Chinese might put on a bathroom or in an airport that make no sense. Who is a native and who isn't is in itself problematic. I don't believe that English is the native language of the United States. I would say Englishes are, there are a variety of Englishes in the United States. I also don't believe that you can teach Spanish in the United States anymore as a foreign language. I think Spanish should be taught as a native language in the United States. All of this forces us to negotiate the being here, not being here in the words that we use all the time. And to conclude, let me tell you, the gentleman that spoke just before you mentioned Don Quixote. Don Quixote to me is the most un-Spanish, most un-Iberian of all books, and thus probably the most Iberian in its rebelliousness, in its Erasmian challenge to what La Hispanidad is. It is a book that when published in 1605 and 1615 was literally looked down at, poo-pooed by the establishment as being unworthy of highbrow culture. And today it is what we have of the golden age, the ultimate jewel. But think about it. There is only one Quixote in Spanish. It's like the Bible, sacred. Few of us would dare to change one word in it, although there are many words that Cervantes himself should have edited out. He didn't. It's a little too long, but. In English, we have 21 different translations of Don Quixote. It's absurd. Do we need 21 full-fledged translations of Don Quixote into English? Well, absolutely we need it, because in translation you can do anything you want, but you can't with the sacredness of the original. The original is unmovable. Translation is the effort at revamping the classic. If you ask me which language is richer in its Quixotic view of the world, I would tell you English. We have 21 different Quixotes, a modernist, a postmodernist, an Elizabethan, a Victorian, all sorts of different approaches to Don Quixote, each translator bringing to it a different interpretation of what Cervantes might have wanted to say. In Spanish, we have only one, like the Bible, untouchable.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, Miss, on the end, I thought the way you read the sonnet about the oak was very beautiful. That was very well performed. In fact, it's been a joy to hear the speakers today. It was very beautiful. Could you tell me one thing, though? When you were reading his stuff, referred to something about verb construction in the Basque language. What is there about that? I'm sorry.
The structure?
Verbs. Something about the verbs in the Basque language. What was behind that?
No, it was just an example. The structure of the Basque language is different, very different, comparing with Latin languages. For instance, the relative clauses or the verb is very different. The relative clauses in Spanish or French or English, they are running toward right, no? The house I bought in Paris, which is a beautiful town, etc. And in Basque, it's just the other side, Paris, beautiful. So I mean, the structure is completely different, and so. But it was just for saying that when I was young, for me, it was very important, and now it's not so much.
I'll take the liberty of asking the last question, and it might seem a little silly. I'm sure there are many people here who speak Spanish, but that there are very few who speak Basque. I'm wondering if you'd just speak a little bit in Basque so we can hear the rhythm and flow and beauty of the language.
Here there are Basque. I think that we are a lot of people. Yes, because I find Basque. Or do you want a poem or something like this? But this is a poem. It's a old song. Goizaldian etxera, zakurra zaunkaka, baratzako pikuan, ontza ujuka. Ari lagundurikan katua miauka, akerra merruka, idilla marruka, oye bila jauka, astu ostikoka, olarra esnatuta kukurrukuka. It's a song for children.
Thank you all very much. And again, a reminder, there are books outside the room for those interested in purchasing them and perhaps getting them signed.